I met a man named Herschel Weber, who was a recent veteran and had been at Harvard in the Graduate School of Design, but had been drafted from school. And we became fairly close. I spent a lot of time with him. He was not a stem winder. He was just a serious somebody who enjoyed the field of landscape architecture. And he encouraged me to apply at Harvard for further study because he thought I guess had something to offer, but primarily because I was a veteran and had prior experience in design of some sort. So here I was with 2 years of alleged experience as an architectural student and 1 year at the University of Georgia and no degree. But because I was a veteran, which I barely was, Harvard would take in the Graduate School of Design such students without a degree. And so that's why I was accepted. When I got there, and this class of 9 students in my year, first year, B.D. Zion always referred to me as Georgia. And we got along very well. I think we discussed Rich Haig, who was from Kentucky, as in our class, and that accounts for about half the class. The names I can't remember the other, but anyway, it was a great sort of vegetable soup of talents and interests who were all combined in one room. And all 3 years of that graduate level were in one room. So we fed off each other or abused each other, but you could always see where you were going. I mean, you could see what was coming ahead. And one of the more vocal students in the year ahead of me was Ian McHarg, and you always knew when Ian was in the room. He enjoyed being the Scot and never let you forget it. Occasionally, we would be privileged to hear from Mr. Gropius, though he really stayed down his end of the hall and more or less kept himself to his colleagues in architecture. But there was a lot of wandering around and exchange of ideas. When I arrived, Bremer Pond, who had been there for some years, was the head of the School of Landscape Architecture. And he was a soft, gentle presence, clearly of the old school in the sense that he was accustomed to working on largely residential properties, more estates than not. Though I remember his showing us photographs of his own small cottage or retreat somewhere in New Hampshire in the woodlands, which obviously showed a softness which reflected his personality. But he was just a wonderful, warm, blithe sort of presence. Lester Collins was, I think, his successor, and Lester was just the opposite. He was young, he was vital, he was spontaneous, he was like one of these fireworks fountains in which sparks and ideas flew off, and they were offered generously. He was very modest and gentlemanly in his approach, but he was, I can only use the word generous to explain. He was willing to offer ideas to everybody and his critiques were really thrilling. I mean, and you would really get a lot out of his observation or his questions of how you were advancing a solution to a problem. The last year I was there, Sasaki was head of department, and I think Lester stayed on staff, but Sasaki was very much a presence, and already at that time he was an object of awe. I mean, there was a lot of respect given to him for his professional competence and what he had achieved at that time. Our first history, I think, actually was Hudnut's history, the first year. And Newton would separately lecture, and I'm sure must have used his slides from his experience. But the more I got out of Newton was his experience as a practitioner than in retrospection about his observations abroad. It was more a recollection of and sharing the experiences of working with the firms he worked with in New York. I always got clear thinking and order from Norman Newton. He was always very precise, and in fact, almost too precise. He was so careful. But when Norman Newton spoke, you had the feeling that whatever he said was worth listening to. The Western studio had been, as a parcel of land, had been given to the school. And by the time I first visited there, which would have been in 48, yeah, there was already a structure there, and it was a very simple 1 or 2 room studio structure, more glass than not. Obviously a product of the architecture department. There was a flat sloping roof. It was fenestration. That was what that architecture was fenestration. And it was glass, as I recall, on 2 sides. And it opened into, it sat on this promontory, and the ground, as I recall, sort of notched into the hill slightly on its backside, but opening, whatever they were, must have been south and east, on the one side into a pasture. It was meant to be a place of experimentation. It was meant to be a place, I think, not taken seriously, but just a chance for architects and landscape architects, I'm sure, to enjoy the same plot and to see the relationship of the two. And there was an illustration to me that they could work together. I mean, there it was in 3 dimensions. In the process, there were a number of odd experimental things, like Lester had stacked up some chimney flue liners to make planters at varying levels. It's sort of like playing a piano. They were different levels and had different diameters or areas, and planted differently. It was sort of a caprice, but that was the whole idea. That was the impression I got. The whole idea was to see it as fun and to experiment.